Well, it's pretty clear that if you want to work with a group of people, you have to be able to understand them. And if you don't understand them, you're often going to miscommunicate or speak past each other. And so in order to engage well and think well about your engagement, you got to spend some time studying the people you want to talk to. Now, generally on this show, it's kind of an apologetic conversation on worldviews and big picture ideas of just how do we engage the culture and the different ideas in culture. Today is going to be more specifically looking at how do we engage Gen Z. So this is for the parents, the pastors, the youth workers, whoever is out there who is engaging or desiring to engage the next generation. Hopefully this conversation is an encouragement and a help to you as you think about this group of people that are so important. And how do we really reach out in a way that makes sense and is meaningful and communicates what we want to communicate? So that is the goal of today's show. My name is Ryan Pauly. This is the show Think Well that is designed to train you to think well about the Christian faith and the culture so you can engage well. Today, engaging Gen Z well. My guest for our show today is the author of this new book, just came out not too long ago, Tanita Maddox. She has her DMin from Phoenix Seminary and is the National Director of Generational Impact for Young Life, an associate regional director in the Mountain West region of Young Life. And so she has been working with Gen Z for over 26 years and has written this book to really kind of help us think through, or maybe make us aware of, what are the questions that Gen Z really is asking, and are we answering the right questions, or are we maybe just saying what we think is right and hoping they kind of follow along? So hopefully it's going to be a fun conversation. But Tanita, thank you so much for joining the show and chatting with me about this.
This sounds like it's going to be a fun conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, I think a lot of these conversations are fun. That's why I have them. But I think, as I told you before we went live, just, in my, I have over 10 years or so, 15, maybe close to now, of working with students as a high school teacher, middle school teacher, and now leading and training in apologetics, and all the time that you've spent with students. I think we definitely have an understanding of just the beauty of Gen Z and just the potential that is there, but often maybe the missed opportunities as well. So I am just now starting my doctoral dissertation project working with how do we equip Gen Z well. This is the result, if I'm not mistaken, of your doctoral work of understanding Gen Z. So maybe let's just take a step back really quick and just kind of walk us through the process of your maybe involvement with Gen Z, but also how this project came about and why you decided to study this for your doctoral work.
Well, it's like you said, I have been in youth ministry since 1998 through the Ministry of Young Life. And somewhere around 2016, I started to notice that things were different, that kids were having a lot of anxiety, sometimes too much anxiety to come to school. That I've noticed that kids didn't want to hang out in groups. I'd get all these I don't want to hang out with everybody. I just want to hang out with you. I noticed some open hostility versus apathy to just the Christian faith. And my first thought was, I must be getting too old to do youth ministry. Like, it must be my problem, right? Like, I was becoming a mom. I thought, man, I was approaching 40, and I just thought, it just must be me. And it was really a friend who just kind of started to push me into a couple books, and I was in the process of working on my DMin, and I thought, what better thing to study than what's happening in adolescent culture? And what I realized was that Gen Z had shown up, and I did not know. They showed up so fast, and they made things so different so quickly that I was caught on my heels. And so I decided that out of my own failings of what was working before was not working anymore, I'd figure out what I needed to do to change, and who these kids were and how I was going to talk to them.
Yeah. Well, I think that's huge. And I think that says a lot, because a lot of times it's easy to kind of get stuck in our ways of saying, here's the right way I think that I need to approach ministry or training or equipping. And I've done all the work. I know the right way. And if it's not working for you, it must be your fault. Clearly not mine. And so for you to kind of say, hey, let's take a step back and try to understand them and figure out how to contextualize this in a way that makes sense, I think is really amazing. Now, for maybe everyone listening, we often hear the term Gen Z thrown out all the time. Kind of what is a rough parameter for what age group of individuals are we talking about with Gen Z?
If you use the birth years of 1997 to 2012, those are generally widely accepted birth years of Gen Z. It's always a little squishy on either end. There's lots of theories on either end of those things, but generally 1997 to 2012, we're talking about Gen Z. This is a group often described as digital natives because they had access to smart and interactive technology from a very young age, and they're very comfortable in that space. They say millennials were marked by the internet coming into our homes, and that Gen Z is marked by smartphones entering into all of our lives. This is a group of people who really highly value safety. That's a generational value that really rose with them. And it's a generation where we've seen a wave of mental health difficulties.
Yeah. So I think that is also really helpful, because when I hear Gen Z, I think high schooler, which that would make sense because it would fall in high school. But I don't think when you go back to 1997, if I just did my math right really quickly, that would be from 13 to 2012 would be 13. 1997 would be a 28-year-old. So we're talking about maybe 13 to 28 years old. I normally don't think of a 28-year-old as being Gen Z. And that's now me, the millennials, saying like, wow, they're growing up so fast. But I think that's helpful to think, who are the people that we're talking to? Because I wonder if people here would be like, oh, well, I work with college students. It's not Gen Z. Because we sometimes just think the younger generation, it must be the high schoolers. Now, in kind of your approach, I think it's also helpful as you talk about some struggles that Gen Z is going through, and they with mental health and a lot of issues that we can see and point to. And I think sometimes that gives us a picture that Gen Z is just a lot of problems, or often, I remember sitting at a conference once where they asked a group of adults, it was the leaders meeting, and they said, what words come to mind when you think of Gen Z? And it was a 100% negative, entitled, selfish, whatever it may be, is 100% negative. Why do you think, maybe let's start with the negative. Like, why do you think that is often the approach? Like, what is it about them or us that we often think, man, Gen Z, and then it's always a negative word that comes to mind?
Yeah, what's interesting is if you ask Gen Zers that same question, what are the words that people are using to describe you? They will also only use negative words. I've never had a Gen Zer say, oh, this is the positive thing that adults in the media are saying about us. Some of it is timeless. Like, for centuries, older generations have complained about the youth. All like that has been around for a long time. It's been the kids these days. I think it got magnified with millennials. Like, it got louder because we had the internet, we had cable. There were more places where we could hear that message. If you were a Gen Xer or a baby boomer, the voices saying that were very limited compared to the amount of voices that were in your life. It might be a couple people down the street or, someone cranky at the store, but it wasn't like all over the place. But with Gen Z, the microphone got so loud. It's like a megaphone coming at them. So it's streaming into their hands, and it's accentuated in online spaces and then in real life spaces. And then it's like a snowball that goes downhill. It collects more and more and more. And so it became this really loud message. So some of it's just timeless and some of it's just got a lot louder. But there is an aspect of like, we just don't understand the kind of pressures that Gen Z has been under. And so we assume that their experience was ours, and we assume we handled it better. But the truth is, I did not have social media as a young person. Yeah. There had never been anyone coming on campuses with guns. Like, that was not even in our mind or a frame of work. There was not a global pandemic that shut my life down in the middle of my development. They just made it look a lot easier. And so I think people went, oh, they're so lazy and they're so weak. And you're like, I don't know how they're still standing. Like, I barely made it through my adolescence.
Yeah. I know. I feel like there's like a small ability to relate in the sense that MySpace came out when I was in high school. And Facebook was released when I was still in high school, but it was back when it was university only. And I remember, I can't wait till I get to college and I get a .edu email address and I can finally get a Facebook. But I remember like with MySpace, for those who are like, what was that? Right? It was the social media, it was the Facebook before Facebook, but you had to pick your like top 8 or top 10 friends. And there was such a social pressure of, man, I put you in my top 10, but if I remove you, now tomorrow you're going to come up to me at school and be like, why did I get moved out of your top 10? And there was just this huge pressure of who do I put? And you've talked about that a little bit in your book of Gen Z being under that similar pressure. And I love the illustration you used where you said in high school when you ran track, you were just mainly competing against yourself. And it was, okay, here's my time and I want to beat my time. Now students today are competing against everyone in the world because they see everyone's times, and no matter what they do, it's almost not good enough. And there's this overwhelming pressure.
Yeah, well, what social media has done, it's like normalized these elite performances. It's,
Yeah.
average is not average. Average is below average in that world. And I'm still a runner. I still get, my my algorithm knows this about me. And I'm a middle-aged woman, so it sends me middle-aged women runners, but it doesn't send me the middle-aged woman runner who, gets out there a couple times a week and maybe is like huffing her way through hills and things like that. It sends me the women who are qualifying for Boston and calling their 7-minute mile an easy jog day. Like that is
Yeah.
almost only what it sends me, which makes that feel like that's the normal standard. And if
Yeah.
I was younger and didn't have that experience for me to say, oh, that's clearly not normal. That's not normal at all. That becomes their normal. And then
Yeah.
their idea of who they're supposed to be is this unreachable bar.
Yeah. Now there seems to be this interesting connection. I'm like so far off my minimal notes that it's crazy already. But there just seems to be such an interesting connection, because what you also talk about in the book is just almost like a distrust for media. And it's almost that they see TikTok as being the only place where there's true information, but then they have issues with that. And it's almost like, well, then we say, well, why don't you just get off social media, stop comparing yourself and get off of it? And it's like, but that's the only place where we can find real people because we don't trust anybody else. And so it almost seems like this circular problem that seems hopeless if we actually stop and think about it.
Yeah, it's difficult because they have a very complex relationship with technology, and it's a system that has been built into. And so to remove yourself from that system, when really a lot of our society runs on social media, a lot of organizations run on social media, our schools advertise things on social media,
Yep.
all those things are happening. And when you remove that, when we've already created a system for this is how you know what's going on, this is how you connect with others, this is how you network, this is how you keep up with what's happening at school. When you remove that, then we've actually cut off a lot of things that there's no other way to get that information. And so that's really difficult. I think our job more specifically isn't necessarily to remove social media, but to figure out how to help young people navigate those spaces. And that's more difficult than I just made it sound, by the way, because we're talking about like high level processing of
Right.
discernment and discretion and wisdom and self-regulation and self-awareness and all those pieces of it. But it's we can't just take it away because it removes many things that they wouldn't have access to.
Yeah. Yeah. And there actually has to be, here's my shameless plug of I contributed to a book on stewarding artificial intelligence, and the manuscript just got sent to the editor, or the publisher, like yesterday. So I'm super pumped about that, but that's part of the conversation. Thank you. I only wrote like 1.5 chapters, but anyways, it's like, but part of the hope in that book is to say, look, we don't want to just say all technology evil, throw it away, because it has actually ingrained itself into society to where it has almost become necessary. You can't go anywhere and escape AI. Like, it is in everything and is a part of everything. And it's just, Mustafa Soliman, an AI expert, talks about it being like the new electricity. Like, it just powers everything and you can't escape it. And so then the question is, then how do we steward it well? We can't just say, throw it away, never use it, because it's in everything. And so now there's that stewardship question that comes in, which is why the book is titled Stewarding AI, Faithfully Using Creation Resources, because it's like that has to be the next step. But it's often easier said than done, because I know I struggle with my own technology use while I'm trying to tell everyone how to use technology well.
Well, I love the way that you said that. It is stewardship. And when I get asked to come speak on technology nights for adolescents and things like that, I say, hey, the best example we have from scripture is by looking at how the Bible talks about money. That money by itself, like without stewardship, without wisdom, without discipline, that money can actually, it destroys us. That's why we see this like horrible stories about lottery winners that were given everything. They were given everything without any wisdom or skills on how to steward it. And that's essentially what we did with smartphones. We handed everything to these young people without any stewardship or any wisdom or any tools on how to steward it. And so I like to think of it like that, just saying, hey, money's not bad. Money can be stewarded for the kingdom. It can be stewarded for good, but with an unhealthy relationship with money, it also can consume us and destroy us. And so I feel like the same thing can be applied to our technology.
Yeah. Well, you talk about how you would ask groups of like, okay, what have you been taught about giving? and stewarding of your money? And the answer is almost nothing. Like it's like we're all expected to use this well, but they're like, how much have we actually come alongside them and equipped them to use it well? Is, I think, a big question. Now, if we kind of slightly shift, it's like, okay, there's a lot of negatives, and we can talk about a lot of the pressures that they're dealing with, and we can come back to some of those as well. What would you say are like the positives? So if you had to describe Gen Z, what words would you use to describe them?
Oh, very self-aware. They understand their feelings, and they can explain why they feel these things. Why they feel the way they do. There's not a lot of "I don't know." They expect a connection between what you believe and how you interact with the world. And so that is one place I feel like they're pushing the church, is to say, hey, your relationship with God should impact how you engage your community, how you engage your neighbor, how you engage the widows and the orphans. And they wouldn't use that terminology. That's Bible terminology. But like, they're pushing us to make that connection between the hands and feet and your faith in God. And I love that about these young people. They are creative. They are, I would say their orientation towards justice is actually a calling out of sin. While now most of Gen Z might not say it's a calling out of sin, here's what justice says. It says, something's wrong that needs to be set right. This cannot be the way the world is supposed to function. It cannot be the way that it's designed to be. And all of that, as we would say, of course not. That's called a fallen world. It's called sin. But that recognition, when they look at the world and say there needs to be something set right, is they have an orientation towards understanding justice and sin that is pretty phenomenal. I love their heart for creation and calling us to care for creation. And like you said, the stewardship is, I think, a big piece of this generation. They're trying to figure out how to steward what's been given to them. I mean, I could go on and on. Also, very funny. They're very, very funny.
That's good. And I think, it's okay. So if they, I mean, I've seen something similar, right? Where there is a deep desire for justice. And I often tell this story in the show. And when I speak of, like, I had a student that just like deeply, deeply desired justice, and he was an atheist, and it was actually kind of walking through, like, how do you make sense of true justice apart from Christianity? And it was after some time that he realized, like, yeah, I recognize, like, true justice is only achievable if Christianity is true and there's a final judgment, and God actually sets all things right, and kind of used it almost like that argument for desire of, you have this desire, is it actually satisfied by your worldview? But I want to kind of take a different approach with you and ask this question of, how does Gen Z see the church at dealing with this issue they see so important with justice? Like, does it seem dismissive by the church to say, well, of course there's brokenness, we're all sinful, versus they're like, I know that, but there's still something that we can or should do? Like, is there a disconnect between the church and Gen Z when it comes to issues like justice? How would you kind of speak into that?
Well, it's talking about the view that Gen Z has of the church, which may or not be an accurate reflection of what the church is doing or is about. And those are two kind of different things. But when we talk about Gen Z's view of the church, they generally, according to a lot of studies and surveys, don't see the church as trustworthy. And part of it's being not trustworthy in enacting or participating in social justice, or in participating in the setting things right that are broken around them. So like the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized, they see those as being overlooked generally, again, overarching generalizations, Gen Z, by the church. And then even some within the church who've studied some of the theological education for young people have said, hey, a lot of this curriculum is focused on just a personal, solitary, individual relationship with God, that it is me and it's up and God. And this is very siloed vertical relationship. And not enough has been written about the horizontal relationship of, how does my vertical relationship with God actually impact how I interact with the world? And so that is exacerbated by just the last few years of Gen Z being surrounded both in streaming services and digital content and social media of stories of injustice incurred by the church and hurt and things like that. And so it's not uncommon for me to come by a young person who says that they have a very negative view of Christianity because of what they've seen on social media or streaming or different shows and things like that. So the story that they've heard and are watching are all these church hurts. What is lost in it, and what we see recalled by a lot of apologists, is going backwards in church history and saying, do you know that the views you hold are because of Christianity? Actually, right? Like if you know your church history, we're going back, right, and saying hospitals, that's because of the church. Like making education available to people, that's the church. Just even our current view of adoption, that's the church. Like that's Paul, actually. That's all these things of why these things matter to you are actually Christian values. I love that story you share of working through that with a young man, because there has to be an outside understanding of justice. We actually do not get to decide. So I like to use this picture of saying my kid wants to decide what's best for him. Like, right. And there's a point where I actually have to decide for him, because he's like a toddler walking towards water. You got to grab that kid before they jump in the lake because they can't swim. So you stop that. Now, if I do not fulfill my obligations as a parent as defined by the state can step in and take over. So they're deciding that. So there's always an outside picture of who's deciding what is just, what is true, what is right, what is fair. It's just that we look at that and say it's God that defines that, but we can't. Yeah. It can never be defined by the individual person.
Yeah. I was literally just asked to preach last weekend. I preached at a church here in Southern California, answering the question, is Christianity good for the world? And I walked through modern medicine, charity, education, women's rights, children's rights, human rights, abolishing of slavery. All of these things actually flowed from theological convictions that Christians had. And then part of the challenge is to say, hey, church, we have these ideas. How often do our right theology actually play out into right beliefs, where we say all people matter, yet we speak in a way that is dehumanizing, or we mock, or we criticize. I love the quote I often give of now I just completely blanked on who it is that said the quote. It'll come to me, and it's John Piper. But he says, like, is it possible that when I recognize like my clever, effective, sarcastic put downs, when I enjoy them too much, I see a deep problem within John Piper, he said. And it's this idea of like, we say people matter and we shouldn't mock and criticize, not criticize, but we shouldn't mock and just put down and make fun of, and we should love and respect people. Yet how do we actually engage in comment sections and online? And if the church is looking at this bickering battle between even Christians on stuff, but also how we speak about outsiders, it's no wonder, I think, of why Gen Z looks at that, or non-Christians look at that and go, I don't want any part of this. And I always say that, and the audience always gets really quiet. And I think it's because they know there's truth to it of how we actually engage, and is there a consistency with what we actually believe.
That's a great point.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book, and I think it kind of relates to what we're talking about here, is this kind of impossible situation that Gen Z is in, where they are expected to do what is right, stand up against what is wrong, and do so without truth as a guide. So kind of walk through this with the audience, because this comes from your chapter where you ask these big questions. In fact, I titled this show like the 7 questions, because that's what your subtitle is. 7 questions Gen Z is really asking, and I didn't actually even give those questions. So here in the book, again, we're talking about this new book that came out. Sorry, we just jumped right into it and we're having fun. The 7 questions that Gen Z is asking about God is God good? Am I enough? Will you accept me? Do all people matter to God? Can I trust you? What is true? Am I safe? And so those are the big questions that they're asking when it comes to the relationship with God and also the church. So in the chapter on like what is true, can you kind of walk through for those listening a little bit of like the conflict or the challenge that Gen Z is dealing with in answering this question of what is true, and why that has put them in this impossible situation of you have to do what's right and stand up against what's wrong, but do so without having truth as a guide?
So all these chapters are going to reflect different values and worldviews that Gen Z is holding, what's really important to them. But without there being an anchoring truth, there's no way to figure out how to prioritize them in any given situation. And they've grown up in a time where really what was told to them is truth is personal. We use personal terms for it. My truth, your truth, her truth, his truth. It's become very personal. And so then I become the decider of what is true, and you get to just decide what's true. All those things are happening at the same time. There is put down of universal truth, and it's been traded for individualized truth because we're in an individualized moment in our personal history. And so now you have no compass given to you. You decide what's true on this journey. But now all these other values have been also put in there. So you also need to accept everybody, right? That's a part of their generous. Will you accept me? So acceptance, tolerance, inclusion, those kinds of words of making sure no one is unfairly judged or left out or marginalized or oppressed or hurt by me. So I want to make sure people feel welcome, they feel known, they feel seen, they are agreed with, they belong, all those things that come along with acceptance. Except that now you add on the other social justice piece we were talking about, but also make sure that anyone doing wrong or harm or evil or bad, that they are stopped. Okay, so now let's put all those three together. And you're like, okay, I'm supposed to accept everybody, except these people over here who are doing the wrong. But then who decides what's wrong? I decide what's wrong, but then and then it starts to there's no way to figure out which value should rise to the top. And when you start to talk to young people, and I've said this to a room of high school students and of college students at different times, where I've said, I cannot imagine how hard it has been for you to stand up for what's right and to fight against what's wrong and have no anchor point of truth telling you what that is. I can't imagine how difficult that must be. And you're stuck trying to accept everyone and also figure out how to not accept everyone at the same time. And you can watch them it's like they exhale. It's like they don't know that that's been happening underneath the surface. And when someone says it out loud, they relax for a second and go, oh my gosh, that is what's been happening. That starts to relieve a little bit of pressure for them. Because then we're offering them is just saying, hey, by the way, there is a way that anchors all this together. In the same way of if they value authenticity, they value acceptance again, right? So should I be my authentic self if I will not be accepted? Which one's the more important value? Do I change who I am to be accepted? Or do I be who I am and risk rejection? Because those are now conflicting values. So that is what's constantly wrestling under the surface is all these values, but without a major truth anchor point to help them figure out what our priorities and which ones should pop up at which times. It's just a chaos. And that's why we see so much, one of the reasons why there's so much anxiety underneath the surface, because how do you navigate that when you don't know what the right thing in any situation is?
Yeah. Now, as I was reading your book, I'm reading all of this, and then I'm also reading what you're talking about of just Gen Z almost losing trust in institutions and trust in authority, because one authority says this is true, another authority says that is true, and so there's this complete distrust as well, or this maybe anxiety going on there. So I'm sitting there going, what do we do? So if they're looking for this anchor point, but then as a person shows up and says, all right, let me give you an anchor point. Well, I'm just part of the Christian institution telling you the Christian way that things need to happen. Why should they trust me? And so how does the church or Christians or mentors or parents go about sort of rebuilding this trust and actually healing some of that disconnect that leads them in this void where they don't know what to do and they don't know who to listen to?
We start to make room for their questions and their doubts. That's one of the misconceptions, or maybe proper conceptions, could depend on your setting, that Gen Z has about the church, is that there's no room for their doubts. There's no room for their questions. There's no place to ask these things. And they really are looking for a place to ask these questions and share their doubts where they won't experience embarrassment or shaming or rebuking in some way for asking the question, because they have that in their everyday life. That's already in the world around them. So they're looking for those places. So we make room for those questions. The number one thing I hear from our Gen Zers is they say, why won't anyone listen to us? They want to talk. They want to be heard. And then, of course, the number one thing I heard from older generations is, we are listening. You're not saying anything. So I realize our communication styles are not meeting. And so we are talking across each other. We're not meeting where we're at, each other where they're at. And so sometimes it's coming up with having the right questions to ask our young person. Sometimes it's providing the right place for them to communicate in their language, whether it is through a meme or a GIF or a movie clip, or my son and I use something called the Between You and Me journal that writes prompts for us to talk to each other through different topics. So there's lots of different ways that it happens. I think we expect our young people to talk to us and communicate with us the way that we want to be communicated with. That's where the problem is. That's why they feel like we're not listening to them. But if you want to try a dangerous question, you can always ask a young person on a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you feel like I listened to you?
That is a good question. I wonder what my 3-year-old would say. But and I think that's so true, because I think there's been times in my life when I was a high school teacher, I had a question folder in the back of the classroom, and I said, anyone can drop any question in there. And each day at the start of class, I answered one question. And it was silly, it was serious, it was everywhere in between. And they utilize that. And there's times where I go to groups and I do Q&A times, and it's just, I cannot even get through all the questions because they just finally have a space where they can like let it out. And then I'll like post on like Instagram and say, all right, what questions do you have for me? And it's crickets and no one asks anything. And so I think it's helpful to see, like, I could go, well, see, they don't have any questions. I'm trying to provide a space, and it's on social media, so they should do it. But it's like, how do we actually stop for a second and go, okay, they don't want to express it here, but they will in these situations. How do we actually facilitate that space where they feel like they can ask those good questions? And I think that relates to a question that Mirza wrote in here, where he said, do you think that kids being exposed to the wider world will make them question their culture and religion? And so is the solution to not expose them so they don't ask questions, or is it, hey, you are exposed and it's good to expose, but that's going to raise some questions that how do we actually make space for? So how do we look at this idea of containing and trying to protect, as well as I want to expose you, knowing that's going to raise questions? How would you kind of navigate that exposure sort of situation?
Man, you're reminding me of a book Sean McDowell just came out with earlier this year, and now I'm blanking on the title. It's like it's like a cult. Do you know
Apologetics for an ever-changing generation?
That's what it is. Yes, thank you.
I don't have that book, but I just saw it this morning somewhere, and so anyways, it was fresh on the mind.
Well, there's a chapter in there that I thought was very intriguing, where it says, don't just talk about what your kids should believe. Ask them questions about the things they're going to run into. So what would you do if your friend says they don't believe in God? Those kinds of things, and help your kids process them, from a young age as they get older, so that they're actually ready to navigate those things when they come their way, because they will come their way at some point. Now, this isn't saying like be age inappropriate and start asking about the things that are not, that, they should not be talking about at their age. But what are age appropriate obstacles they're going to run into? And start introducing those at the dinner table at night and talking about those things. I thought that was a really intriguing place to be. I like to be proactive in the conversation as much as we possibly can. That's age appropriate. And actually, if you look at the research, that's what Gen Alpha parents are doing, is they watch Gen Z. I should say my kids are Gen Alpha. We watched the way that Gen Z was navigating the world and seeing the things that they came up against that we were not prepared to talk about when they were young. And now Gen Alpha parents are compensating by having some of these conversations earlier, like internet safety and gun violence, pornography, these different places that are now becoming younger conversations for their kids, so that they are equipped to navigate the things that they're going to come across.
Yeah, that's good. And I just looked it up. Apologetics for an Ever-Changing Culture is the title. A biblical and culturally relevant approach to talking about God. So with this idea of kind of apologetics for a changing culture, one of the things you talk about at the beginning is the church is answering questions that students aren't really asking. And so where do you see the disconnect there? Like, what questions is the church answering, assuming that's the questions students have, versus I'm assuming that what we just read, here's the big 7 questions students are asking. So then which ones is the church answering?
Well, so I, again, have been a Young Life leader for a long time. And so we share the gospel through our weekly kind of club gatherings, what we call our club talks. And we follow a very basic outline of, who Jesus is, what is sin, what happens in the cross, the resurrection, and how does one respond to that. And I was answering questions about Jesus like, yeah, Jesus is human and Jesus is God. He's 100% both those things. And Jesus has time for you, and Jesus knows your name. And you know what? None of the kids were asking any of those questions, actually. And they weren't asking about sin as the kind of explanation of a universal morality or a relationship with an eternal being. They weren't asking questions about those either. However, what I realized is all those questions that I wrote about in that book that you listed actually overlap with the Christian doctrine and theological topics that we were talking about. It's just I wasn't answering those questions with the theology. I was just providing the theology and doctrine while ignoring what was happening over here. However, now when I talk about the incarnation, I can talk about, can I trust God? Hey, here's one example, one reason that we can trust who God is. And it is in the person of Jesus Christ. And we can actually see God up close. He walked a mile, not in your literal shoes, but he walked the human existence. There's nothing that happens in the human existence, the human experience that Jesus didn't also experience as a human. What was commonly human, he experienced. And if you trust people who share your experiences, which is kind of what research says, we tend to trust people who share experiences with us. Here's one way we can trust God. And now I can address that Jesus is human, that Jesus is God, but I'm also addressing a question they have at the exact same time.
Yeah. That's so huge, because I think it reminds me of a book I read on evangelizing Mormons. And the idea was in chapter 1, it was something about evangelizing Mormon culture. And the point the author was making was evangelical Christians sometimes think very theologically, where we think about the doctrine of the Trinity and we start parsing through the doctrine of the Trinity and how that makes sense logically and biblically. And we go, see, there, I made a case for it. And with a Mormon, they said Mormons are much more story driven. And it's more of a story culture. And so then the question is not to say, well, that's bad or whatever, you need to think logically like me. And it's also not to throw the logic out and just now everything is in story form, but how do you communicate the beauty and truth of the Trinity in a way that shows how God has impacted you personally, right? And this experience that you have had with the triune God. And so you're talking about personal experience, but grounded in this truth theologically. And so it's not that we're throwing out scripture or out these truths. It's not saying, all right, get rid of the Bible and let's just relate to where they are now, but it's how do we answer these deep questions that they are asking, almost talking about the same topics we're talking about before, but recognizing a different way in which it hits. Now, I always bring up like a very specific example that an author wrote in the book, and they're like, I don't remember saying that. So hopefully I wrote that. Oh, interesting. So if this doesn't work, that's okay. But you shared the story about Zacchaeus. I don't know if you remember kind of the point you made with Zacchaeus of we like, see, Jesus accepts you, he accepts Zacchaeus, but then like, how can we take this deeper? If that's something that clicks in your mind, I'd love to kind of have you share that a little bit with the audience as well.
When I started looking at these questions, and I really do, there's a little worksheet in that book that I actually use in my real life. This is something that's real that I have, that I put next to my Bible while I'm reading passages, especially when I'm going to teach or talk about something with Gen Zers. And I use that kind of lens to look through and say, hey, how do these questions, how are they reflected in this passage? And Zacchaeus is such a beautiful passage because actually, if you really sit down with all those questions, it addresses all of them. But when I was stopping short at what I thought was important, which is, oh, Jesus sees you and he knows your name, I actually missed a bunch of levels of what was going on. Like, for example, the piece of justice that we see in there, that when Zacchaeus interacts with Jesus, that his heart becomes like God's, and God's heart cares for justice, so setting things right, so Zacchaeus pays everything back, and for caring for those who are in need. So he also is going to pay four times more? To the poor and the needy, but he's giving. So what we see then is we see God's heart for justice, and we see God's heart for mercy, for acceptance, for loving people who are in need. And I missed that because I stopped short of where I thought it was important, when actually there's these other layers of what's going on that answers the questions that they were asking, but I'd never looked for them before.
Yeah. And I think that's so good because, again, I think that's the whole point. And what I'm trying to communicate with this idea is that it's not about, throwing stuff out, but it's maybe taking stuff deeper or taking that story and recognizing different ways in which it applies while still staying true to the context of that story and what was being communicated there. There's these significant meanings. And I think that's an aspect of scripture being alive where when you've gone through things, like if I don't have a certain experience, I read something in the Bible and I go, oh, okay, doesn't, cool. Sounds good. But then all of a sudden you've experienced something that is then referenced in scripture, and that verse hits home all the more. And that's, I think, the idea here is that maybe there's times that I just don't see aspects in scripture because it's not an issue or a value or something that I'm really wrestling with. And so it doesn't stand out in that passage when it really is there, and it's not, reading into scripture, but drawing deeper meaning out of. And I think that's so good. Now with this idea of Zacchaeus as well, you talk about this idea of safety and this question of he got out of the tree. And you reference this deep need that Gen Z has for safety, asking this question of safety and kind of walk through in your chapter of maybe some false ideas and ultimately the truth that safety is an assurance of who we are in Christ, beloved, adopted, redeemed, ransomed, restored, and ultimately resurrected. So we kind of talk about maybe a little bit of like, what can the church do to become a place that is trustworthy? And it's maybe opening ourselves up for questions. What's something that we can do to help Gen Z recognize, hey, I'm someone who is safe for you to talk to?
Safety is such a complex topic. Because safety, as far as the word safe, has been redefined to include so many things, right? Yep. When I was growing up, it was like, don't talk to strangers and don't ride in the bed of a pickup truck. Those were like the two rules. Like it was really about physical safety, but that was it. So, well,
have you seen that funny, sorry to cut you off. Have you seen that funny meme where it was like when we were kids, it was don't talk to strangers, don't get in a car with strangers. And one other thing. And then now it's like, use your phone to call a stranger so that a stranger can give you a ride. It's like, like how we look at, ride sharing services today is like exact opposite of advice that we were given as a young person. But anyways, the irony there, but safety for them today.
And we know this because this is part of our world now. They grew up in this world where safety has been expanded to emotional safety and intellectual safety or psychological safety. And that it's even been expanded further to safety from being from risk, safety from failure, safety from being uncomfortable, safety from being disagreed with, and on and on and on. And it's gotten so broad that we actually have this incredibly wide definition of what safe is. But then again, let's go back to the individual. It's also individualized. And so if I did a survey of 10 people, 10 Gen Zers, and said, write down 3 things that'll make you safe in this conversation, we might have 30 different things, and there might be things that conflict with one another. So one person will say, please call on me. Then I feel like I have room to express myself and I've been getting the platform. And you might have someone else that says, please never call on me. I'm going to feel like called out and embarrassed. And you're like, okay, so here's where it gets complex. If you're going to throw around the word safe, like I'm a safe person, this is a safe place, you better follow up with a very concrete definition of what you mean by safe. How are you defining what safe is in that space and what it's not? Not that you have to have a giant complex answer, but if you are just throwing this word around and they have an idea of what it means to them and you have an idea of what it means to you, and you cross or come in contrast or conflict with what they have decided is safe, you've not only proved yourself unsafe, you've proved yourself untrustworthy. So we say, hey, let's define what it is in this space, like what that means. I'd also be careful of just throwing around that, our Aslan, line in which the wardrobe quote, because some of our older Christian friends, meaning older than 35, are like, oh yeah, of course, Aslan, he's not safe, he's good. Yay, I answered the question. And what we really did was introduce this incredible conflict of values. So instead of saying, our Gen Zers would say good is safe and safe is good. And you just told me not safe, but good. That's introducing tension. It's okay to introduce tension. We should introduce tension, but we should know when we're doing it instead of thinking we're calming everyone down, but really we introduced a tense place. So all of that is like all this upfront communication to have with our Gen Zers to define the space so they know how to engage with it, and that we have an agreement almost on our terms of engagement of how we're gonna engage with this space. And more Gen Zers are starting to say, hey, I think this idea that safety is kind of always being successful, always being comfortable, always being happy, I think that might not be the greatest thing. And so we kind of get to lean in there. And like you said, with that lovely quote that you read is that God does have a definition of safety and what it means to be safe in him. And the world has a version of safety and what it means to be safe. And we have to figure out where that paradigm shift needs to happen so that we are actually working under God's definition of safety and not an incorrect or flawed or distorted version of safety.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. Now I'm curious, there's something I often teach, and I'm wondering if in your conversations with Gen Z, if you've heard anything similar. But when I speak on gender identity, I have a slide that I go through of like, as we respond, we have to see the person, right? That the transgender individual, the one suffering from gender confusion, or gender dysphoria, whatever it may be, is asking these questions like, who am I? Where do I belong? What is the reason for my life and existence? What does the world have to offer me? Where's God in this? And am I wanted here? And I wish I would have written down exactly where I found this number, because I want to be able to cite my source and I don't remember anymore. But I read in some study somewhere that 83% of non-Christians want to talk to a Christian, but don't think the Christian wants to talk to them. And I often will stop there and I'll say, why do you think that's the case? And why do you think that a transgender individual, or just a non-Christian in general, doesn't feel like a Christian is safe to talk to? However you want to define safe, they just don't feel like you're a person that I could actually talk to about this. And I stop in, and with this conversation, I say, is it possible that it's because of how we speak about the gay jokes or trans jokes or atheist jokes? Is it possible we mock and joke about transgenderism in a crude way, and then the person sitting there who's struggling with gender confusion, it's like, well, definitely not that person. They're not safe because they're clearly mocking this idea and thinking it's ridiculous. And so I wonder if maybe in your conversations, if you've even heard things about that, of like feeling like Christians aren't safe because of how we speak or because of how we stand on certain things, that like, hey, if I bring this up, they just are going to criticize how I am. I mean, I talked to one trans individual who sat through a lecture where she finished the lecture feeling like the enemy, because the way in which transgenderism was spoken about is trans people are destroying America. They're destroying women's sports. And so they're, almost like this enemy to be destroyed. And so it's like, well, clearly I can't talk to you about my struggle because I am the enemy destroying America. And so I wonder if there's an aspect that you've seen as far as not feeling safe because even just how Christians talk, and that leads to the hypocrisy as well, possibly.
I haven't read anything specifically or heard anything specifically about how Christians talk. I've seen view of Christian stuff. And so, or view of Christians. So with both faith-based and non-faith-based surveys, like the combination is generally Gen Zers view Christians as hypocritical, as judgmental, as intolerant, anti-gay, irrelevant, so all these things are actually just floating around there. Now, I haven't read any research that goes deeper into why those words are being used to describe Christians or the church. I'm sure we can make lots of guesses why. There's probably lots of reasons why those words are floating out there. But that is the overwhelming view. And so if that's the reputation and the general ideas that Gen Z has about Christians and the church, then of course that's going to go into the unsafe category.
Yeah. And I think that's just so, I don't know. I find that to just hit home with groups as well, because at least if it maybe, even if it's not the exact reason why there's a certain feeling, it causes that self-reflection of like, man, how do I speak? Does that reflect what I think is true and how I should be speaking? And do I speak and talk about issues in a way where if someone dealt with it? Because I taught a high school group once, and I got done teaching on biblical sexuality to a high school classroom, and a student at the end raises his hand and says, now, how would you have said this differently if someone in the room was gay? And the thought was, well, why would I have said things differently? And to me, it kind of expressed this assumption that, well, when you're in a safe space, when you're with like-minded people, you're going to speak in certain ways that are not the same as if someone is in the room that possibly struggled with the thing that you're talking about. And I said, well, no, I know I've done this enough and know in any group I'm in, there's probably someone that has same-sex attraction or struggling with their sexuality or their identity or their gender. There's something going on. And am I addressing this in a way that, yes, is staying in line with what is true, but in a thoughtful and compassionate, nuanced way that at the end, they're actually willing to come talk to me. And at least that question fosters, they say, am I that sort of person that someone would say, I want to talk to that person because I'm curious what they have to think. And I think that's kind of one of the aspects of safety that comes to my mind, at least, as I was reading through your chapter. Okay, so I think safety is a huge thing that they're asking this sort of question. Now, I'm curious, kind of going back to something I was wondering at the beginning. So big switch in topics is, I do a lot of apologetics. I mean, I have my master's in apologetics. I do a lot of apologetics, but then also trying to figure out, like, how do we do apologetics for this new generation? And so how do you see kind of the role of defending the Christian truth claims, but then also these deeper questions? I think kind of goes back a little bit what we're talking about is you do it, but in a way in which it's hitting different. So how would you kind of see like the role of like really helping students understand the deeper truth claims of Christianity, as well as addressing these deep needs that they have, or the connection between those two?
Well, contextualization is that marriage, right? It's missiology and it's apologetics, and it's taking all the theology and the doctrine and the church history and then translating it to a cultural, an audience within a specific culture at a specific moment in time. And let's all realize that every gospel message we've heard has been contextualized. Most of the doctrine that's been taught to us has been contextual. It's all been contextualized so that we could understand it. And so what we're asking people to do, or inviting people to do now with Gen Z, is what has been done for us. And so the mistake we make is we assume that the message we heard was not contextualized, and we repeat the contextualized message for an audience it was not designed for. And that's where I think part of the reputation of the church being irrelevant starts to come into play, because we're not speaking a relevant message, meaning like it's not pertaining to the real issues of life. And so this goes back to looking at Paul in Athens, who did a lot of listening and a lot of understanding. He knew the poetry, he knew the philosophy, he knew his audience, and then he chose to speak to his audience in a way that made sense to them, using their cultural points, their references, their ideas, in order to reframe who God is and who their relationship with God, or what the relationship with God should be. And so that's really what we're looking at, is saying, can we understand Gen Z well enough that we can take the mysteries of God and explain them in a way that makes sense to them in their worldview, with their values and how they're engaging the world. It's like any other cross-cultural interaction where we're trying to communicate something. We take a lot of time to understand who that culture is, what their language is, so that we can make sure to best express the truths of the church and like I said, the mysteries of God in a way that could possibly be understood by the culture we're speaking to.
Yeah, it just, it's, if we're speaking a different language, it just makes sense. It's just not going to hit home. And so how do we actually take the time? I think I was training a YWAM group last week, doing a whole week of lectures, and I made the claim, we have to take culture seriously. And one of the leaders is like, what do you mean by that? Like flush that out a little bit. What does it mean to take things seriously? And I think part of it is like, am I willing to say Gen Z matters enough, or this group matters enough, or this person matters enough, or this community matters enough that I'm actually going to spend time to learn about them, whether it's learn their language or learn their culture or learn their behaviors or learn whatever, so that I can communicate effectively? Or am I just going to stay in my simplistic slogans and say, just trust Jesus and that's all you need to do? What's the problem with that? And keep it simple, because that's maybe what worked for me. And I think that's what this book does, is say, I want to take Gen Z seriously, and really get to know them better, so that we can really engage with them well, because in a way that they feel heard and listened to.
Well, I ran into this quote over here from This is the Gospel After Christendom. And this one I double highlighted because I loved it so much. And I think expresses the heart of what you were sharing with that group from YWAM. This says, we can't love our neighbor without having some idea of our neighborhood. And I love that piece of just understand the neighborhood.
Yeah. If we don't understand, I think, and I shared something similar where it's like, how can you fulfill the command of Christ to love your neighbor if you don't even know who they are? If you're unwilling to engage them, or you only think negatively about them. And if we have this negative view of they're just whatever, then we're never going to engage well. Or when we do engage, it's going to be done poorly. And so that, I think, is the challenge here of how do we kind of create this maybe better perception of the generation, or want to get to know them in order to relate to them well. Now, in that kind of question as well, on kind of the apologetic, have you seen a shift in your time with students from, or maybe it's just always been missed, or I don't know, or it's still there, but the question of not just does God exist, but is God good? So are you working with mostly non-Christian students, mostly Christian students? Or is it, okay, we already are Christians, we believe that God exists, now I'm asking the question, is he good? Or is it even the non-Christian students are like, yeah, but if God existed, is he good? And is that a deeper question than just, does he exist?
Yeah, so in my contacts with Young Life, we're an outreach ministry. So most of the kids that I am in contact with, most of the young people are unchurched or disinterested kids. Though we do have some kids who are actively growing in their faith. And I also have college-age volunteers, right? And college-age leaders who are growing in their faith. But when I open up this question a fair amount in rooms, with 300 to 600 students, and say, tell me what people your age are asking about God. And they will come up with, how can you prove God is real? But there's a lot more questions about why. Why would God let this happen? Why would God do this? A lot of questions of why, which is what I summarize to them. I say, hey, there's a lot of questions on there. And what you're really asking is God good? Because if God is good, he must have a good reason for these things that are going on that seems so bad. Yeah. And again, that's a timeless question. Let's recognize these are timeless questions, but if we don't understand the lens in which they're experiencing this question, we'll give a wrong or irrelevant answer by accident. And so if we don't understand that part of this question is being asked behind a lens of depression, of high rates of suicide and suicide ideation and self-harm, anxiety, high rates of loneliness, and then the cry of the heart is God good? There's a lot there that has to be peeled back. I love apologetics, but one thing apologetics doesn't solve is pain. And I say this as someone, I really love apologetics. I like practicing apologetics, but I know the limitation of my ministry when I realize that there's not an answer to pain. And sometimes that is God good part is really allowing our young people to understand that God understands pain, that God is with them in pain. And we can point to times in scripture where God endures pain. And that's part of the heart behind that question that they're asking. But again, this is individualized society with an individualized generation. So if they're coming up with personal ideas of truth, they're coming up with personal ideas of good, then running God through their lens and deciding whether or not God is good, rather than reversing that and understanding that God is actually the source of all goodness and defines what is good.
Yeah. No, I highlighted that, and now I don't know where it was because I'm not finding it on the pages, but you said something to the effect of what you just said there. And I was just trying to find the quote, but that idea of, is it possible that we have misconceptions about what God should do? He didn't do it, and therefore he's not good, when actually it's a misconception that has to be torn down about what we expect God to do versus whether that's a true expectation we should be placing upon him and others.
I mean,
so
go ahead.
No, go for it. Yeah, answer that and I'll follow up.
Well, I was saying, I love that we see this in scripture, because when Lazarus dies, Mary and Martha, both of their first words are, if you would have been here, this wouldn't have happened. Yeah. So this idea that if Jesus had shown up, they wouldn't have experienced this death.
Yeah. And yeah, because clearly Jesus would heal, right? He should have. People often bring up the question of like, where was Joseph? Why wasn't he at the cross? And then some people speculate and say maybe he died. And it's like, well, then Jesus possibly let his own dad die. It's like, how do we make sense of that if that's what's taking place? And placing these sort of expectations of why would God do what we want him to do? Is it because we always have known rightly? Now, at the same time, you bring up this idea of, one of the reasons why Gen Z has questions about God's goodness is the fact that they're globally connected, that they are just experiencing or being made aware of suffering all over the world and injustice all over the world, and trying to make sense of how do I reconcile that with a good God? And even how should Christians be responding to this? And is the church responding correctly? So how do we then I feel like there's another like tension that we have of saying, okay, you are asking this question because there is injustice taking place and there's problems around the world, and it's a real question of like, why are these things happening? And it's coming from a real place. But then also this idea that we're just not designed to know everything, and this leads to this internal responsibility that can become overwhelming and crippling as well. And so how do we find that balance of like, we have wrong expectations, at the same time, we are aware of what's going on and we wish them to be differently. And now adults are trying to come in saying, here, let me help you make sense of this. And we don't want to be dismissive and just go, no, don't have that expectation. That's bad stuff. It'll keep happening. But we also don't want to say, yep, everything, if we just do the right thing, we can expect it all to get better. How do we navigate this battle with Gen Z?
Holy smokes. You uncovered like 3 or 4 major topics in that one question.
It's a long question. I have so many thoughts in my mind.
I know you dabbled a little prosperity gospel. You're dabbling with some ideas of suffering. Like there's so many things going on. I don't even know where to start with that. Except
well, maybe, I mean, because I think it's good. And I did like just dump a huge load on you. But I think that right, that's the question I feel like is the struggle of they want justice, and that's good. And they are exposed to a lot, which can be good, but is also overwhelming. And yet we also then have unrealistic expectations. And so we're trying to address real issues, but also combat expectations. And I feel like it's this, again, the person trying to wrestle with Gen Z who is globally minded, aware of all this, but maybe approaching it with these wrong ideas of we should, it can become overwhelming where maybe even the listeners hearing my question go, that's exactly why I don't know what to do. Like, where do we start? How do we come? And maybe it's just, okay, let's listen. Let's be in relationship. Let's meet them where they are. But I don't know if there's a simple way to say, here's how we just get that ball rolling.
Yeah, I think part of it, like, and everything you said is also pain, right? That those all things come out of pain. I'm not supposed to hold all of this. And I cannot live up to the expectations that people have given to me. Like those are pain points. And so I think part of it is calling out what's true. And you know what is true? You are not God, and you are not designed to know everything that was going on at all times. Like that is, if you are feeling wear and tear emotionally, mentally, physically, because you know about all these things, it's because you were not designed to carry all these things. So that is real. My friend Sean McGeever has a book called The Good News of Our Limits that really focuses in on where our humanity kind of stops, where God starts, and why limitations are actually freeing in understanding that we cannot hold these things. We cannot do all the things. And that's a movement. It's a discipline. It's part of discipleship because our young people, our Gen Zers, have been told they should be able to do all of these things, and they should be able to do them perfectly, and not actually should be able to. It's expected that they do, and if they don't, then they should be called out and shamed and canceled and rejected. So that's what's happening on their surface is some fear of even movement. Because if I risk doing the wrong thing, then I'll be even worse off than if I did nothing at all. And so we have to gently kind of remove those layers of lies that they should know everything, that they can do everything to change it, that they will let people down if they don't do the exact right thing all the time. All these places that they'll suffer forever in socially and professionally if they don't handle everything perfectly. All these pressures that are underneath, and then at the same time, there is a teaching of not being afraid of pain. So that. I coached track and field for a long time. Did you do sports growing up?
I did. Sports. Yeah, I did baseball, basketball, and golf in high school.
All right. So this I think is a concept that's familiar to most athletes, and especially if someone coach. That my job as coaching sprinters was to damage the muscle just a little bit on our sprint workouts, and then you left a day to recover, so that you would cause little tears in the muscle, and then the recovery, they would heal and they'd feel stronger. So your muscles would be stronger after this, right? And we go through that pattern of it. If I never push those muscles to that point, they would never get stronger. They'd actually be terrible. They'd be weaker. They'd be awful. It's actually that pain and those little tears that heal, that allow that muscle to be stronger and faster when you run the next time. we are built in those same ways, and we can walk through that. Part of it is having to share our own pain. Kids assume that we're fine if we look fine on the outside. They assume that our relationships, all our friendships, we get along on everything because they assume that your friendships must be with people you agree with and who agree with you. They assume that that our failures are non-existent or they were a long time ago. So some of this is just saying things out loud to the young people while we're in process every day in our normal everyday setting. It's taking some of those abstract concepts like, okay, how's this for the Bible concept or Christian concept? You should give that to God. Have you used right? Give it to God. That is such an abstract concept that if we actually sat down and wrote down steps like, okay, how does one do that? I would do that with a Gen Zer, have them sit down next to you and say, what does that mean? So that we can actually help them process that instead of just saying, things like, well, when I was growing up, it was get over it, forgive that person, give it to God. Let it go. But those are all ideas that are dealing with pain that we have not really helped our Gen Zers figure out how to do.
Yeah. And it seems to have, like, as we talked about as well, there's just a conflict in values where when you look at like the worldview of technology, it is about ease. It is about comfort. It is about immediacy and this idea of like, this is the highest value in life. And I think, I forget the exact word off the top of my head, but it's like when Gen Z is asked, what's the highest value? It's like to be happy or something of that nature. And so it's like, we have these values then of ease and comfort and happiness that are directly in conflict with what we know is actually what produces growth. And, I always point back to Romans, suffering produces endurance, or endurance produces character, hope that doesn't disappoint. And maybe there's a value to suffering, and there's a value to chores, and there's a value to waiting, and there's a value to these sort of things. But now we're kind of coming up with conflicting values. How do you go about sitting down with Gen Z, trying to get them to maybe unravel some of those values that we often see of happiness and ease and comfort, and actually recognizing challenge and stressing and these sort of things are values that make them better?
Some of it's just asking them who they want to be. What are the things they want to see in their life? What are the fruits they want to see in their life? What are characteristics they'd like to be true about them? What do they want people to say about them? All these are kind of like, not ideals, but they're different places they'd like to grow and develop in. And when we talk about it, like I can say things like my job as a track coach was to make sure that if you were an athlete, that when you show up to the next meet, you ran faster than you've ever run in your entire life up to that moment. And that's really ridiculous. The next week, we also do that again. So like now you're going to run faster than you've ever run up to this moment. It's such a mind-boggling thing when you really think about it. It said, these things take growth, and growth does mean change, and change means pain in some ways. It means being uncomfortable. So sometimes it's just asking like, hey, what's your comfort level with discomfort? What's your comfort level with failure? And what's your comfort level with pain? Because these are the things that need to happen in order for us to get to these places. Now, like, it doesn't mean I'm going to push you over the edge, but how far can I push? If you know, and know that there's also rest. It's not just a constant push of pain. That's how you tear muscles. That's how you have running injuries. That's how you lose a season. We pull back and we say, let's rest. And so with what I get called for actually more often this year specifically is how to work with Gen Z aged employees, how to manage, supervise, grow young people in ministry or young employees. And some of it's these questions of, well, where do you want to grow? And what's your comfort level with failure? And helping supervisors pre-talk about obstacles. Like, you're going to run into obstacles. Let's just start there. You're going to run into surprises and obstacles in your goal. And when we talk later, I want you to process those things so that our young Gen Zers are starting off their path already knowing, I'm going to run into obstacles and surprises. Those do not mean I did something wrong. They don't mean that I failed. They don't mean there's something wrong with me. It's just part of the learning process. And that sounds like a no-brainer, right? For you or for me, they're like, of course, but that has not been their generational context. And so we have to explain those things.
Yeah. And I think it's also when I do it, they know it's true. Like when I stop
Mm-hmm.
and say, don't you see how you're better after pushing through that assignment and enduring and fighting through, and like, don't you see like the benefit to that? And it's like, oh yeah, of course. But you know, but when we're constantly kind of hear this message of it's about ease and comfort and productivity and whatnot, that it can sometimes, I think, cloud our judgments in how we actually go about approaching this. So in all of this, what is like kind of your hope for the church? We've talked about it throughout the last hour and a half, but how would you kind of summarize, like, what are you hoping the church learns? What are you hoping that adults learn, or do differently? Kind of what would be like the next steps? Like, okay, I do want to do better. What would you advise for adults in working with Gen Z?
Well, I mean, big picture wise, I think there's some recognition that all people bear the image of God, which means every generation is going to reflect some aspects of the image of God that the other generations may not reflect as strongly. And so, one of the gifts that we get to do is we get to look at Gen Z and say, how are they reflecting the image of God in a way that's unique to their generation? And then the joy of it is figuring out, how do we draw that out of them? How do we help them reflect it even further in who God designed them to be? And that is that's not making them conform to me. That's allowing them to reflect how God created this generation to be. And I think it's such an incredible gift. So I'd say a couple of things is one, we start speaking words of vision over the next generation, that young people live into what we speak over them. And so be careful of what we say. Speak vision, speak hope, speak words that are worthy to live into for our next generation. I think the next one is just grab a Gen Zer for a conversation. Have them just ask this question: what do you wish people my age understood about what it's like to be your age? And then be quiet. Like, don't tell stories about when you were 16 or 20 or whatever. You know, don't tell stories about that relate with their experiences. I know you want to connect. We all want to connect. But we start with the first conversation of I just want to understand. So any words out of your mouth should be another follow-up question or an affirmation of the person in front of you. Wow, that must be really hard. Wow, that took a lot of courage. You know, those kind of things. And start listening. I think we'll be amazed at what our Gen Zers start to tell us about how they're seeing the world and the things they're learning when we stop and say, what do you wish I understood?
Yeah. And one of the things I think in practically, so you grab someone, you ask them these questions, but one of the practical things you also say in here that I thought was so good is like, invite them to just do life with you. And that they actually want to just do chores or run errands, and that may be something that they enjoy. Like what have you found in that?
This goes along with the authenticity piece. They're so used to curated social media feeds and edited photos, and so when you invite a Gen Zer over for a meal at your house, they're not looking for the fine china and the pressed tablecloth. They don't want to show. They want to know what real life looks like. Because they actually are looking for, if you're following Jesus and you're as a mentor in their life as someone who's following Jesus, they're really looking for, how does that impact my everyday life? How does it impact how what you choose to buy and how you set up your home and how do you talk to your kids and how do you spend money and all these things? They want to know it's integrated into our life. And so if they walk in and they see the pile of laundry that's sitting on the couch and they pull up a stool up to your counter and you hand them a potato peeler and say, all right, we're going to peel potatoes. Like that feels more like I'm getting a real picture of who you are instead of who you want me to see. And then what I'm learning more and more about this is that I need to verbalize out loud how my walk with Jesus Christ is impacting my day and the decisions that I'm making. And it sounds really cheesy, and it's going to feel so cheesy the first time you say this out loud. Like, really is. I'm just saying, like, man, I am so thankful that God made seasons, because wouldn't it be so boring if it was one weather all of the time? Or like I'm making this meal because I believe God created our bodies to thrive, and here's the ways he's taught us to do it with health and with nutrition. We say those little things out loud, and you might get a roll of an eyes and exhale. It's fine. It's normal. Like that's normal. But these are the things that our young people remember. They're rolling their eyes because you said something that actually sticks out to them. And
Yeah.
so they're paying attention and figuring out how to integrate their faith in all those things. But that's what they want to see. They don't want to see a pretty picture of perfection. They want to see the raw and unfiltered, doing chores, painting the house, running errands, all those things.
Yep. Yeah. And that's one thing that we often do we almost have no other option as a family with a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, and one on the way. It's like, if you're going to come, if we're going to be able to do anything with you, it's just bringing you into our life, and you're going to sit at the dinner table, and my boys are going to do what they do at dinner tables. And that's just what happens. And this is the life that you have. But there still is also a beauty of just saying, hey, why don't you just come with me? And I've been surprised, maybe, just how many students are willing to just say, oh, sure, I'll come with you. Whatever it is, I'm going off to speak at an event or whatever it is. And it's like, hey, you want to come with me? Sure. And you just tag along and chat about life and just see how things are going. So love it. Love it. Thank you so much for the work that you did in this, for joining the show and chatting with my audience about it. Hopefully it's encouragement to them, whether they work with Gen Z or not. I think this is also kind of giving a big picture of like, hey, I need to take whoever it is that I'm talking to seriously and get to know them, rather than just assuming whatever it was that grabbed me or interested me or saved me is what I'm just going to give them. And so just that need to really take the people we want to minister to seriously and having intentional, real relationships with them. So thank you for this work and for joining. Is there some places other than like jumping over to Amazon, picking this up? Are there more ways in which they can kind of follow you and the work that you're doing with Young Life or different endeavors that you have?
Yeah, my website, TanitaMaddox.com. There's always some free resources and articles there. You can also reach me through my website to chat over Zoom or grab a call sometime. And then my Instagram is at Dr. Tanita Maddox.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
All right, everybody, again, there it is. Go pick up a copy of that book. Really fascinating, really interesting, incredible read. Just so you know, with Thanksgiving this week, I'm not going to be doing a live stream on Friday. I'm actually going to be in San Diego Friday speaking to the Assemblies of God Southern California Youth Convention. So that is what's going to happen this week. Next week, I actually have to cancel my Think Well live stream. Last minute flight to Colorado to visit my ailing grandpa. And so December 2nd, there's not going to be a show, but I do plan to be back December 5 for the live stream debate show to discuss morality and the question of, is God good and how should we live? So that's when I'm going to see you next. December 9 is an interview with Fred Sanders on union with Christ and the life of faith. So anyway, so those are some future shows that you can look forward to. Hopefully today's been an encouragement and challenge you to think about how you engage the next generation, because they are important and valuable and should be engaged well. So with that, thank you for being here. Thank you for your involvement and engagement. Also, one last thing is I did just launch the year-end challenge. So if you want some more information on contributing to Think Well and our year-end challenge and partnering in that way, you can definitely head over to think-well.org for more information on our donate page, and I would really greatly appreciate that. So thank you for being here. Hopefully it has been an encouragement to you, and I will see you next week on Friday, the Friday after the Thanksgiving week. Bye, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. See you later, and happy Thanksgiving.